Hello, friends. Welcome back to the show. Today, I am talking with Dr. Lauren Cook, licensed clinical psychologist, company consultant, author, and speaker. Lauren has a doctorate in clinical psychology and her master's in marriage and family therapy. She appears frequently in the media to provide commentary while also running her own private practice. Hardship Psychological Services. Oh, I'm so glad. Okay, I'm gonna do it again.
All good.
Running her own private practice, Hardship Psychological Services, serving all clients residing in California. In addition to that, she can be found on TikTok, Instagram. She hosts the Brain Health Book Club, as well as the podcast Boardroom Brain. And her new book, Generation Anxiety, just hit the shelves in the last month. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm a big time
Yeah.
fan of yours, Sarah Jane. So I'm like super pumped to get to talk with you today.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you. We did a live on Instagram, and I was like, we need this conversation to be so much longer. We had so many questions come in. So I was like, I know people are interested. Um, and it was just such a joy to talk to you. So I'm so excited.
Oh, the feeling is mutual. So thank you for creating the space.
Yeah. Okay. So you wrote a book, Generation Anxiety.
Mhm.
Why Generation Anxiety?
Yeah, a lot of people have been asking, well, why are we so anxious? Other generations have, some people love the line, have had it worse, which, oh, that makes my
Mm,
ears cringe a little bit. Every generation, though, has had their own plights, right? I think
mhm,
what we're seeing right now that's maybe a little bit different is that, yes, anxiety is increasing both in prevalence and severity. So more people are anxious
mhm,
and the level of anxiety is more intense. My
mhm.
hypothesis on why that is, and this comes from the Stress in America survey, they reported that 75% of young adults feel unsafe in this country, in the United States, every single day. And the number
Gee.
one thing that they attribute to, I love to ask people if they have any guess what they think it is. I'm so curious, Sarah Jane, what would your guess be for like the number one fear young adults have today?
Oh my gosh. The number one fear, I mean, I'm afraid it's like guns, but
It
I don't
is.
know. Okay.
No, that's spot on. And a lot of people like that is the answer they give. And I think that shows like we are just heightened alert. And like I noticed it even yesterday, like driving to pick my son up from daycare. There's somebody
Mhm,
just walking on the side of the road. He's minding his own business. And
mhm.
my brain goes to the place, is this a safe person? Are they going to do something? Am
Yeah,
I going to run into them picking up my son?
yeah,
That is
yeah.
so sad that my mind
What
goes there. And yet that's the kind of the reality of our world right now.
Yeah, my kid's home from school today because there
Mm.
was a shooter threat.
What?
Today. Yeah, yeah.
See, this is what I'm talking about. And, you know,
Mhm,
we are living in a world right now where, and it's not the case, the majority of people are safe to be around, but everybody feels
mhm,
like could be a potential threat. We don't feel safe with
mhm.
each other. And our human brains, like we need and crave community. We don't have that right now. And I think that's very
Yeah.
much contributing to anxiety for folks.
Do you think because I wonder, I think sometimes about like, okay, like 1950s,
Hmm.
you were worried about like the people in your neighborhood, the people
Yeah.
in your workplace. But now I can worry about the farthest reaches of the earth because I have access to so much information all the time
Hmm.
that my
Hmm.
anxiety can spike, and then additionally, I'm seeing videos of things constantly.
Yes. We're inundated by the news. The news cycle is just constant. Social media, especially with the algorithm, we know that the algorithm
Mhm.
pushes out content that is more eye catching. And typically that is pretty like negative, hard to watch content. And yet our
Mhm.
brain is like, ooh, let me take this in. So
Yeah.
it knows how to play up to our fears. And I think one thing too, we're very concerned about the future of this planet, with things
Mhm.
like climate change. We can feel pretty helpless and hopeless with that sometimes. That's a
Mhm.
precursor to feeling anxious and then ultimately feeling depressed. I write a lot in the book about what we can actually do about that, right? So that we don't
Mhm.
just feel like so bogged down by it. But I think we do have to first validate, like, yes, these are legitimate fears that are uncomfy. We can't gaslight ourselves into thinking, oh, yeah, no, you shouldn't worry
Mhm.
about these things because they are hard.
Yeah. My friend Mari wrote a poem like when COVID was happening where it was talking about she said I think she said something like the world is burning and I'm washing my face.
Mm,
And like that was so visceral to me because that's how it feels like I need to stay hyper vigilant, right? And sometimes I feel like we're in order to be a good person,
mm,
I need to be aware of everything that's happening in the world and I need to be constantly on guard to it. And if I'm just kind of washing my face, enjoying my skincare routine, then I'm part of the problem, or that's what
mm.
my like brain likes to say. And so I
Mhm.
love that you're saying like, yeah, we can self-soothe. Like there are
Yes.
tools. Um yeah, so what if we're holding that complexity, right? Like
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
I guess like the question being how do we navigate wanting to be conscious
Mhm.
while not being consumed?
Yes, yes, yes. I like to integrate what I call empowered acceptance.
Mm,
One, we have to accept what is. A lot of us, we get so avoidant. I don't want to hear about these things. I don't want to know about these things.
mhm,
And that actually can exacerbate anxiety because in that suppression, that's a lot of
mhm,
mental energy. So if we can accept and say, all right, I see this for what it is, and
mhm,
perhaps that is where I can have some control in the narrative and my perspective is, being mindful of my reactions to these things, right? Being mindful of
mhm,
setting boundaries sometimes. I always say with the news, for example, if you've already heard it once and you're noticing you're hearing it multiple times, you got it the first time.
mhm.
That can be a
Yeah.
boundary you set of like, all right, we're going to turn the TV off for today on that front. Um, and at the same time, like, I think we have to be empowered too. Like, I'm very much a behaviorist as a therapist, I'll say. Like,
Mhm,
I really think we have to take action. And so, if the action is washing our face, for example, if that feels good for us, let's give ourselves that permission. And in fact, like, even appreciate that we're doing that for ourselves. Like,
mhm,
that self compassion piece is so, so important. That can very much be a way to work through anxiety. So we have to be empowered in how we show up in our lives. And that really does include taking action in a lot of different ways.
hmm. So I know you take a systems approach. Can you tell us what does that mean?
Yeah. So this kind of comes back to my MFT days, marriage and family therapy. And it really does look at the person in the context of their whole world, right? That can look like
Mhm,
everything from our intersectional identity, how our gender, our age, our ethnicity, our race, our abilities, all these different things weave together, right? To make us the person
mhm,
that we are in the context of our communities. And I do write about in the book, when it comes to anxiety, there can be different levels of privilege with it. For
mhm,
some of us, our anxiety, it's the privilege of, oh, where should I go to college, or oh, I can't
mhm.
decide, if what house to buy, for example. Yes, that's anxiety. There's privilege that we're getting to have anxiety about these things, right? For others, our anxiety, it's automatic. There are some of us who
Mhm.
do not feel safe in the beds that we go to sleep in at night, or we don't have a bed to
Yeah.
sleep in at night. And I really wanted to very much legitimize that in the book that, like, listen, we each have our different environments that we are living in. We have to validate
Mhm,
those experiences uh, because how can one not have anxiety in those situations? And how can that not be
mhm,
generational too? I write in the book
mhm.
about some really interesting research about the traumas that happen to our grandparents, for example. We are seeing physical effects of that in the bodies of their grandchildren. And it's not to say that
Wild.
that can't be changed or countered, right? I don't want people to hear that and feel like, well, shoot, I'm screwed. It's not like an
Yeah.
automatic, this is what it is. But I do think we really need to look at how generationally, systemically, this is not just
Mhm.
something that's in people's heads.
Yeah. I love this so much because I think oftentimes when we get advice about anxiety, especially, it's like it's so self focused, or it can be so
Yeah.
focused on just like your isolated being. Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so hearing you say, yeah, all of these different factors are going to affect the way that someone experiences this and the way that,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I'm curious. So just for the people at home who might be like, okay, so I did come from a privileged environment and
Mm-hmm.
I still experience anxiety, which, yeah, is it valid? Because I know I can hear my audience like disqualifying themselves.
Right. And we don't want to necessarily get into the shouldn'ts, like, because I meet so many
Mhm,
folks, right, where like they have or they haven't like necessarily gone
mhm,
through a traumatic experience and yet they still experience anxiety. And
mhm,
the point that I make in the book is if you're anxious, you're anxious. Like it doesn't necessarily need to be like a reason for it. Like we have to
mhm,
allow that within ourselves. It's okay that we feel anxious, you don't need to necessarily have earned the badge of anxiety to feel it. For some of us it's just that amygdala in our brain, that little almond piece that's so deep in our brain. For some of us it's just more active than for another person,
mhm,
and the more that we can accept that and allow, like, yep, I feel anxious, that
mhm,
often in itself deflates the anxiety, because so many of us are expending so much energy. I call it mental treading, trying to make the
mhm,
anxiety go away, when really we've got to switch that and say, yep,
mhm,
I feel anxious. It's going to be here sometimes. That's often what actually takes the wind out of its sails.
yeah, oh my gosh. And we I'm so interested because when my husband and I kind of met, we came from very different approaches of
Mm.
thought. So I am an Enneagram 7. He's with a pretty hardy 8 wing. He's an Enneagram 4 with a pretty hardy 5 wing. So we're pretty
Okay.
like, and we came to it. I was very all self-reliant, self-responsibility. What can I
Mm-hmm.
control? Like, if I can't take action on it, I don't want to think about it.
Mm.
And he came from the world, like my circumstances are my reality and
Mm.
determine my behavior, and to the point where maybe I won't do the things that are best for me because the circumstances are so oppressive. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we're learning to walk towards each other, right? Like in
Mm-hmm.
that. But I think what I learned from being in a relationship to him is that our circumstances impact us. And I think like I
Yes.
honestly learned that from him, like for the first time in my life,
Mm-hmm.
that I'm
Mm-hmm.
not supposed to just be a robot who shows up the same no matter what's happening in the world, what's happened in my life, the trauma that I've
Mm-hmm.
experienced. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's new. That was news to me.
Yeah, yeah. I feel that so much too, because I'm an Enneagram 3, wing 2. And speaking of like robots, like when we have a goal as Enneagram 3 is like charge ahead no matter what, right? And yet, like, really, I mean, that's what I love about 4s. I feel like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I sense that they sometimes are a little more willing to integrate some self compassion of like,
Mhm,
hey, I feel this way. Like, let's validate this. There are things going on in
mhm,
my world that are making me feel this way. And really giving ourselves that permission. Uh, Settling into that is sometimes really hard, right? Because with
mhm,
anxiety, we want to control, right? Even we want to control our circumstances. And the reality is, we can't always do that. And I think, in
mhm,
fact, most of the time we can't do that. And so the more we can kind of lay back in the hammock and say, like, hey, this is like the situation, let's embrace some of
mhm,
the discomfort. I think there's a lot of liberation in that, but it feels pretty scary for us to take that leap of faith, I think.
mhm. Yeah, because I'm thinking, what is on the other side of that? Like, what's the fear or the risk of letting go? Because it feels so scary.
Mhm. Mhm. I mean, I feel this like the most profoundly right now in my life. I think being a new mom, like I had so
Mhm,
many anxieties about becoming a parent in terms of, well, how am I going to like have a career and be a parent? And,
mhm,
also like on a physical level, I've struggled with emetophobia for most of my life. Like debilitating fear of vomit, which is a little bit
Mhm.
niche, but a lot of people have actually come out and said that they really struggle with it too. These were
Mhm.
things where I was like, I'm not sure like I can do this. And yet like I had
Mhm.
to ask myself the regret question. Would I regret if I mean, hopefully I live a long life, but would I regret like not making the choice to have children, for example? And
Mhm.
the answer was yes. And I knew in that moment, like my anxiety had been calling the shots on that. And so that was like my cue from the universe of like, let's embrace this discomfort. Like it's not going to get
Mhm.
easier. It's not going to go away. My anxiety is always going to give an excuse for why now is not the right time, or I'm just not ready yet. And
Yeah.
I don't know if we're allowed to use expletives, so I'll give the PG version. In most cases with anxiety, we got to eventually get a case of the efforts and say like,
Yeah.
screw it. Like these things matter too much in my life that I'm not going to let anxiety call the shots anymore.
Mm. I think that was I that's like eye-opening, when you hear
Mm,
that, or because anxiety feels so much like something to avoid,
yeah.
that when you say like I'm going to move into it and do the thing I want to do anyway,
Yes.
um it sounds like how is that going to help? But it does. Like
Mhm.
I know but it does. It feels like, well, that can't be it. I'm supposed to move away from that feeling.
But that's what sucks so much about anxiety. The more like you feed it dollars, like the more it
Yeah.
starts to like take over your life. And it's like, if you think of
Mm.
it like if anxiety is in your house and you just keep like letting it take up space, you're going to eventually be
Mhm.
balled up in a corner and it has taken up every crevice of that room, you know? And
Yeah.
so that's where I think we do have to push back a little bit and say, like, no, like, it's okay if you're here. Like, it's okay. I have had panic attacks in front of people. It's like, and
Mhm.
so what? You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
if we can start to lean into that, it's amazing how it can lose its power over us. But when you're not on the other side of that yet, that can feel very scary to step into.
Yeah, and as I've, like, been tapping into that this year a lot, and we've talked about it on the podcast a lot of, like, how it feels so counterintuitive to move in, but it actually is, like, helping me a ton, and I like you said, like, if you feed it, it grows.
Mhm.
And I do feel like there are so many opportunities to feed it. I at this point, I mean, there's nothing wrong with TikTok. I love TikTok. Your algorithm could be totally different than mine. But
Mm.
my algorithm was like, let's look at all the things that are scary for you. And I could
Oh.
retrain it, but it was like, yeah, I had to constantly just take steps back because
Mm.
it was just feeding it. It was feeding the little
Mhm.
anxiety beast.
Yeah, it's so hard, right? And like I find a lot of folks ask, like, well, how do I know like when to lean in and when to lean out? And I like to use a metric a little bit of like, let's take a scale of 0 to 10. 10 is like, you will put me in a full panic attack if I am facing this
Mhm.
fear. One is like, I'm chill, I got this. If you're like in that 4 to 6 range, that's like a good cue for the self of like, okay, like let's lean into this a little bit. But if you're
Mhm.
getting into the 7, 8, 9, like it's going to be traumatizing for you to lean in, then that's a cue of
Mhm.
like, okay, let's get some support. Let's honor like what the body is telling us. I don't think we should just like charge ahead necessarily and flood ourselves to face our
Mhm.
fears, right? Like, even in working through my fear of vomit, I worked with a provider. You know, the treatment is exposure and response prevention. So we literally, I'm
Mhm.
not kidding, like looked at pictures of vomit, watched videos of people
Yeah.
vomit. We didn't just start with that, right? Like you have to like build your way up. It's like working out a muscle. You're not going to go run a marathon the first day. So I do think we have to be mindful and give ourselves grace as we're facing our fears, because it's not easy work, and I really want to
Mhm.
validate that for people.
Yeah, I love that, and I am interested. Well, okay, so first of all, I think you have like, I am, like my growth journey is, like, fully on track with us having this interview right now. I was, like, looking at
Mm.
the next question I had, like, noted for myself with you, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is my" people who listen to the podcast regularly are going to be like, literally, this is what you just talked about, which is, you said values induction over pain reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I am a really big advocate of getting very clear on what our values are. And a lot of us, like, if we actually were asked, like, what our values are, we struggle to, like, come up with our top
Mhm.
10. You know, a lot of folks will say, like, family, friends, but no, like, what are your values? And that's part of why I love the Enneagram so much, because sometimes it does have a framework of, like, some general values that we may
Mhm.
cherish. The thing is, anxiety will make us want to seek comfort every time. It will often make us want to
Mhm.
avoid, right? And we can have these very strong values in our life, but anxiety can come around every time and say, you want this thing, you're not ready, it's not your time yet. You need to do XYZ first before you can have your values, right? The thing is, when we choose our values, there's often pain attached to it. Let's say you're in an unhealthy relationship, your values are not being met, but it is painful to go through a breakup. Or let's say you need to change jobs. It's painful to leave that job. We as humans
Mhm.
tend to crave comfort and homeostasis, even if it's not serving us. So, this is
Mhm.
why I say let's get crystal clear on what our values are, because when we do make those tough decisions and it is painful for us, we can be grounded in it, knowing I did this from a place of choosing my values. And that is going to give me fortitude when it's not easy. And I think that's
Mhm.
something really important for us to lean into, because a lot of us, we choose comfort and feeding the anxiety
Mhm.
beast instead of leaning into what our ultimate values are.
Yeah. And I almost think about, like, even when you said comfort and feeding the anxiety beast together, I was like, that's what TikTok was for me. It was like a
Mm,
comforting way of staying hypervigilant. It was like, if I have all the information, then I can't be caught off guard, rather
mm,
than like, I will take the actions, I will take the risk, I will
mm,
be so mentally stimulated and aware that
mm,
I'll know not to take the risk when the time comes.
mm, mm. Well, and
Mhm,
Tara Brach talks about this of like radical acceptance, which is,
mhm,
I think, an amazing concept that I think feels a little bit scary to folks at first, of like embracing total acceptance of like, I accept the pain. I accept the not knowing. I accept the
mhm,
looking like an idiot sometimes, and that
mhm,
being okay, right? Which I
mhm,
think can feel so scary in our society, where we feel like we have to like always have our ish together and like be the expert.
mhm,
But to radically accept of like, yeah, I'm a like goofy, flawed human being, like bumbling my way through this world.
mhm,
If we can allow ourselves to sit in that space, like I said, the anxiety really starts to deflate. It loses
mhm.
its power over us. And I think we can also like experience more genuine joy too, because we're taking off some of that pressure of like always having to stick the landing, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Man, I'm working so much with people starting businesses right now. It is like I'm doing it almost every day, and that fear of hitting the publish button, that fear of like claiming a space, claiming a niche, like I'm like watching it happen, that sensation
Mm-hmm.
of like all of the unknowns on the other side of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and hitting the button anyway. How do we do that? How do we go for, I mean, I hear you saying acceptance, and I think I totally get that. But like for those at home who are like, yeah, yeah, acceptance, right?
Mm-hmm.
But who's going to judge me? What's going to happen? What
Mm-hmm.
if blank? What if
Yeah.
the monster in the closet comes out and it's scarier than I thought?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love that you're bringing all this up, and we deep dive in this in generation anxiety. There's a few different things to tell yourself. Okay, the mind wants to hear the mental tape of what happens after we hit the publish button.
Mhm.
So play that tape. Like, what is the worst case scenario? And a lot of times as we go through that exercise, we realize, okay, it wouldn't be fun, it wouldn't be comfy, and I would get through to another day. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And also saying to ourselves, so what? Like, I think we've got to deflate things a little bit, almost integrating a sense of playfulness. Like, we put
Mhm.
so much pressure on ourselves that,
Mhm.
I think we have to ask ourselves, like, okay, someone judges my work. So what? It wasn't for them,
Mhm.
right? Uh, so that's a place we can go to. And then I think lastly, we have to ask ourselves the why. Like, why are we
Mhm.
doing this? I, as an Enneagram 3, I can get very caught up sometimes in doing things because I want that public approval or um, my own ambitious need, right? Like, let's just name that
Mhm.
for what it is. There's the acceptance piece of it, even though sometimes I really don't like that part about myself.
Mhm.
All of these different sides to it, we have to ask the why. And how am I hoping to serve or support or help someone in doing this? That can help us maybe set aside the ego sometimes, that it's not about our own need per se. It's about maybe
Mhm.
this is going to serve someone else in some way that we don't even know or see come to fruition right
Mhm.
away. And that can give us, I think, some fuel when it is feeling really
Yeah.
uncomfy.
I love that because it is like kind of coming back to and the values induction piece of like coming back to what do I value? Why am I doing this?
Mm-hmm,
Mm.
mm-hmm. Exactly.
One one phrase that you use that I really like and I'd love to hear you talk about too is not just acceptance, but you kind of add in empowered acceptance,
Mm-hmm,
which
mm-hmm,
just reading those two words put together, I just want to tell you what it did for me because I'm a 7. So if
mm-hmm.
you tell me what to do, I sometimes feel like, no. I also have this sense of like, well, if I just accept things that I'm going to be settling, I'm going to not live my best life ever. I'm going to like look back with regret. I'm going to have
Mm-hmm,
lived a passive, boring life. But
mm-hmm,
empowered acceptance, it's like there's something about that I go, well, that's a choice.
mm-hmm.
I'm choosing to accept it. But I want to hear from you kind of why those two words together.
I love that. It's so cool to hear how that impacted. Yeah, because I think a lot of us, we can feel like acceptance is apathy, right? And
Mhm.
it's certainly not that. Like, I like to say acceptance is mindfulness with our eyes wide open. And there is also that like behavioral side of me too, where I really do believe the brain, it needs evidence, it needs action. That's why I will often say like positive thinking, manifesting, like it's
Mhm.
not enough. Like I think many of us maybe wish that could be the case. But like, take for example, with your clients you're working with, you can't think your
Yeah.
way into writing an article. Your fingers have to type the words out, hitting the publish button.
Mhm.
You hit that action, right? You can't think your
Mhm.
way into it. And so that's why I say, the more you can show yourself the evidence. I asked that person out on the date, or I had that tough
Mhm.
conversation with my boss. You did those things. And so then the brain kind of
Yeah.
has to sit back and say, like, well, shoot, like, I have to take this evidence in now that maybe you are
Yeah.
capable. I think that's one of the best ways to work through imposter syndrome is to
Mhm.
actually do it, feeling scared, and to see that, okay, like my anxiety didn't like totally derail me, right? And
Mhm.
maybe I even was like visibly shaking or sweating. And that's where we come back in with the two things. So what? Okay, you were like sweaty. Welcome to being a human, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing too, I really hope we can start to like lean into the fact that many human beings are compassionate, are empathetic. Like, we often think people are so judgmental and cruel when it comes to anxiety. And sure,
Mhm.
like there are bullies in this world. That's their stuff. Most people, if they see us making an effort and they can tell it's hard for us, they're like,
Mhm.
yes, I admire that. I wish I could do the same, right? And so I think
Yeah.
we have to hold that people are more compassionate towards us than we often
Mhm.
believe.
I think that's so true. And I can say, y'all, I have done so many speaking engagements visibly shaking and sweaty
Mm-hmm.
and like fine. It's fine.
Same here. I've had a panic attack during a talk. It happens. Yeah.
Mhm. Oh, that's so good. Um, So, for those at home who want to stay in touch with you, who want to grab your book, who want to stay
Yeah.
connected to your work, where can they find you online?
So I'm at drlaurencook.com. The book Generation Anxiety is wherever you like to buy books. Shop small with your local indie bookseller if you like. I love to speak as well, so I often come in with companies and teams. And I should know, if you have any listeners who love to read, we host the Brain Health Book Club, where every month we bring in different authors. Sarah Jane, I think we're going to have to feature your book one of these months, if you're
I
if
love
you're
that.
willing to join us. But it's a great community, so join us if you love to read too. And I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. Lauren Cook.
Sweet. Thank you so much for being here. This was so informational and supportive.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. Really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah.